In this video, we're going to take a look at some characteristics of data that we are going to be interested in. We'll just talk about what those characteristics are right now, and then we'll look at some other terms associated with frequency distributions. And then our next video, we will talk about what frequency distributions are. Let's talk about some characteristics of data that are of interest to us. So the first characteristic of data that we might want to think about is what is the center of the data, right? So how do we identify what the center of the data is? And that might seem like a simple idea. We're used to talking about maybe averages in some cases. We might not use that term quite as frequently here in statistics because what we mean by average is typically the center, and the way that we measure that center, that varies depending on the data and what measurement of center is perhaps most meaningful. Not only will we be interested in the center, we'll also be interested in the amount of variation that occurs. Right, so is the data spread out a lot? Is it really clustered together towards the center? We might look at those kinds of things, and we'll try to get a hold on some of those measures. We're also interested in the distribution. So how is it distributed? The most common distribution that people are aware of is probably a bell-shaped distribution. That shows up very naturally in a lot of settings. But there are other kinds of distributions. We can have, for discrete data, we can have binomial distributions or Poisson distributions. We can have, for continuous data, we can have uniform distributions. We already talked about a normal distribution. There's a chi-squared distribution. There are all kinds of different distributions that we might look at or might have. We also are going to be interested in outliers. Right, so what is an outlier? So how do we measure those? And then this final thing that we'll be interested in is time. How does our data behave over time? And so depending on the context, the situation that we have, these different characteristics might be important. Some may be more important than others, but many of those will have a role in our information, in our statistics that we want to look at. All right, so one thing that is worthwhile that we might want to do, that we might want to take a look at, is we might want to look at a frequency distribution. So frequency distribution. This shows how data is spread out among several classes by listing the class along with the frequency in each class, right? So that is the number of values that show up in each class. And so there are a variety of different terms associated with frequency distributions. Let's go through those so we just have the terminology down. So the first term that we have is lower class limits. And these are the smallest numbers that could possibly belong to different classes. Right, so we have lower class limits. You might imagine if we have lower class limits, then maybe we also have upper class limits. And we do. And so these are the largest numbers that could possibly belong to different classes. So we have our lower class limits and upper class limits. We also have class boundaries. These class boundaries, these are simply numbers that are used to separate. You gotta keep them separated. Used to separate classes. We add the upper class limit to the lower class limit of the next class and divide that by 2. We can continue this process and we can extrapolate it. We can continue that process for values above the first class or after the last class. You just have to imagine what the previous upper class limit would be to find the boundary that occurs before the first lower class limit, and do the opposite to find the boundary after the last upper class limit. So we have lower and upper class limits. We have class boundaries. We also have class midpoints. And these are just values in the middle. Why don't you meet me in the middle? Right, so these are values in the middle of the classes. Here we add the upper class limit and lower class limit of the same class and then divide by 2. Right, so it's similar to finding class boundaries, but with class boundaries we're taking 2 consecutive classes and we're finding the point that kind of separates those. Class midpoints, we're adding the upper and lower class limits of the same class. And then the final thing that we have is class widths. Class widths. Class width is the difference between 2 consecutive lower class limits. And I say between 2 consecutive lower class limits. You could also go with upper class limits or class midpoints or class boundaries. The way that you do that in general is you would subtract the lower class limit from the next lower class limit, or the upper class limit from the next upper class limit, or the class midpoint from the next class midpoint, or the class boundary from the next class boundary. But those are all terms that we will be interested in. And I know it's a little bit strange because we haven't really seen a frequency distribution yet, but we'll take a look at that in the next video. We'll see you there.